Saladin was born in 1137 in the city of Tikrit on the Tigris River, but a dispute with the local lord forced his family to move. He grew up in the shadow of the Crusader states and was still a young boy when Edessa fell. The struggle for him between Islam and Christianity was always palpable. Eventually, he and his family settled in Damascus, where the cosmopolitan nature of the city afforded him an excellent education. He was an avid reader, extremely intelligent, and hungry for knowledge. He became well acquainted in many fields: astronomy, philosophy, law, theology, to name a few. James Reston, in his book, Warriors of God, describes the young man well. Quote, "Though he was slight of build, his intelligence, his mannerliness, his generosity, and his piety were noticed in the palaces of Damascus. He was drawn to wine and women in his adolescence, but the seriousness of the historical situation eventually impressed him, and he renounced these temptations." Later, it would be said that from the education of his sovereign, Nur ad-Din, Yusuf, later known as Saladin, learned to walk the path of righteousness, to act virtuously, and to be zealous in waging war against the infidels. In the court of Damascus, the principle of striving in Allah's cause was emphasized, and the youth took to heart his invocation in the Quran: "Those who strive in our cause will surely guide in our way, for Allah is with those who do right." End quote. Saladin's education would continue, now in the field of warfare, when he joined the army at the age of 14. 2 years later, in 1163, he would follow his uncle Shurka into Egypt as ordered by Nur ad-Din. As mentioned before, Egypt was secured after 6 years of intense fighting in January of 1169, and Shurka died 2 months later. And by the way, by some chroniclers, it has been said that poison was involved. James Reston explains what happened next. Quote, "Nur ad-Din settled on Saladin as his uncle's successor. The young soldier was chosen not because of his strengths, but because of his perceived weaknesses of his youth and inexperience. In truth, Nur ad-Din didn't want a powerful competitor in Cairo, and he was certain that he could control his malleable and polite ward. In this, he would be disappointed." End quote. The 32-year-old new vizier declared his undying loyalty to Nur ad-Din and set to work supplanting Shiite with Sunni Islam in Egypt. But under this veneer, Saladin was already busy implementing his own agenda. He systematically raised military forces that were loyal only to him while placing members of his own family in key positions in government. He revitalized trade networks and established a substantial fleet in order to better protect the sea lanes of the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. By making this move, the money began to just pour in, making the new vizier immensely rich. Now with that money, Saladin became a patron to his people, earning their adoration. A vast building project was established with a strong emphasis on education. Schools, libraries, and even a college were built. Money was then sent to Mecca and Medina, and so Saladin gained even more esteem as being a patron of the holy places of Islam. But this rising wealth and popularity didn't sit well with Nur ad-Din, who ordered his subordinate to return to Damascus immediately. Saladin, however, came up with numerous excuses why he couldn't return and reasserted that he was doing nothing but being loyal. Nur ad-Din didn't buy it. In 1174, the Sultan raised an enormous army with the intent to take back Egypt, and most likely execute his vizier in the process. For Saladin, it would seem that the game was up. I mean, after all, his rightful lord was marching in at the head of a huge force, and he would either have to prove his loyalty or his battlefield prowess. But just as Nur ad-Din was about to lead his men, he became very ill, and a few days later, on May 15, 1174, he died in Damascus. and his heir, by the way, was only 11 years old. Ah, opportunity! Saladin rushed to Damascus under the premise of paying respects to his sovereign. He arrived in the city in November of 1174 and was welcomed in by the common people as his virtuous reputation preceded him. Once he got his foot through the gate, he went right to work. He married Nur ad-Din's widow and declared himself the regent to Nur ad-Din's young heir. The youth, by the way, would die of disease a few years later, but not all in the Zengid family were happy with this takeover. Thus, Saladin mobilized his army and over the next several months conducted a lightning campaign to bring Syria, or at least most of it, under his control. This would culminate at the Battle of the Horns of Hama on April 13, 1175, where Saladin absolutely crushed a Zengid army. It would not be long after this that he would be recognized by the Caliph as being the Sultan of both Egypt and Syria. James Reston again summarizes the situation really well. Quote, "At the age of 38, Saladin took power in both Damascus and Cairo. Centuries-old divisions evaporated. The Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt was finished, and with its demise, Sunnism of the north supplemented Shiaism along the Nile. Saladin was declared king of Syria and was recognized by the Caliph in Baghdad. Saladin would later proclaim, 'When God gave me the land of Egypt, I was sure that he meant Palestine for me as well.'" The dream of a united front against the Christians was a reality at last. That dream was the Christian nightmare. For 90 years, through skillful alliances and offensives, destabilizing raids and strategic castles, the Latin kingdom had kept its enemies off balance. The survival of the Latin kingdom would now depend on its internal discipline and its military skill. End quote. In the very same year that Saladin had seized the throne of Syria, 1174, the rather belligerent King Amalric of Jerusalem died of dysentery. He was succeeded by King Baldwin IV, who at the time was in his early teens and afflicted with leprosy. When the Sultan had better secured his hold over Syria by beating back the Zengid dynasty, he sensed a ripe opportunity to attack and to pay back the Crusaders for staging multiple raids into his territory. Saladin marshaled his forces and invaded the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177, but Baldwin IV proved he was both an intelligent and effective leader. Saladin may have had a larger force, but he made a rare mistake of underestimating his enemy and dispersed his troops. The young king, despite being outnumbered, managed to catch Saladin by surprise through deft maneuvering. On November 25, 1177, Baldwin IV won a spectacular victory and crushed the Muslim army at the Battle of Montescort. Saladin was nearly killed in the fray, and only through sheer luck did he make it back to Cairo, but he left his army devastated behind him. However, the Sultan was not done. He would rally his men, and over the next 3 years would continue to fight and would win several victories over the Latins. Eventually, in 1180, both sides were exhausted with war, and in the setting of a severe drought, agreed to a 2-year truce. But this peace would be precarious at best, and when it ended, hostilities began almost immediately. In 1183, Saladin managed to take Aleppo. This victory made him arguably the most powerful man in the Levant, and gave him the initiative to attack the Crusader states from along the entire front with Syria and also from Egypt. It was only the resolve of the Crusader High Command that kept the Sultan's attacks in check, but this too would not last. In 1185, Baldwin IV died. Before he passed, he was able to secure a 4-year truce with the Sultan. Saladin, who was dealing with the last Zengid stronghold in Mosul, readily agreed. But Baldwin IV didn't have a direct heir. He was succeeded by his nephew Baldwin V, who was only a child and died the next year. Therefore, the throne of Jerusalem would go to Baldwin's sister Sibylla, who shortly thereafter crowned her husband, Guy of Lusignan. Guy was the son of a minor lord in western France. He was banished from his land at an early age and took to crusading more to escape than for religious obligation. But the man had an eye for opportunity, and in 1180 he married Sibylla, which turned out to be a good move. A mere 6 years later, he found himself king of Jerusalem, and this just in time to face the gathering storm of an all-out war that would soon be upon him. When we last left Renald de Chatillon, he was groveling at the feet of Emperor Emmanuel I Komnenos. If you recall, this was in Antioch in 1159 after his barbarous raid of Byzantine Cyprus. Some people would perhaps at this point rethought their actions, but this man didn't. The very next year, while raiding again, this time in the Anti-Taurus Mountains, he was captured by Nur ad-Din's men and thrown into prison in Aleppo, where he'd reside for the next 16 years. Now, little is known of his time in imprisonment, but it's probably safe to say that he nursed his hatred of all things Muslim. After being released, he made his way to Jerusalem, where he began to make allies quickly. He was King Baldwin's second in command at the Battle of Montescort, where Saladin's impressive army was annihilated. Renald gained the reputation of being a fierce warrior and would bring the fight to his enemies. In 1183, he even built a fleet of ships to raid Muslim ports in the Red Sea with the intent to attack Mecca and burn the Kaaba to the ground. However, he really wouldn't come close. His fleet was eventually destroyed by Saladin's navy. Later, from a political standpoint, Renald would become one of the biggest supporters of Guy of Lusignan's ascension. He obviously backed the right horse. Guy would become king, and Renald found himself lord of one of the most formidable castles in the Crusader Kingdom, the fortress of Kerak. The fortress was nearly impregnable. It had been besieged numerous times, but to little avail. And as it turned out, it was the perfect spot to retire to after a hard day of, well, raiding and pillaging. Strategically, it lay on the pilgrimage route between Damascus and Mecca, so when Baldwin IV and Saladin agreed to a truce, caravans began to make their way past the imposing Kerak on a regular basis, which was simply too tempting for Renald to pass up. He broke the peace, attacked the convoys, which in turn incited the anger of the Sultan. Meanwhile, the King of Jerusalem knew that the Crusader states were in a precarious position, being nearly surrounded by the Sultan's empire. Baldwin IV knew that the truce was critical to survival. He severely admonished Renald for his raids, but this really didn't do much, and when Baldwin IV died, Renald only intensified his attacks. It was in early 1187 that an especially rich caravan was making its way from Cairo to Damascus. The leader of this convoy had faith in the truce, so the caravan itself was only lightly armed. Thus, when Renald attacked it, he had no difficulty capturing it. Its riches were confiscated and its people were imprisoned. However, as it would turn out, one of the prisoners that Renald took that day just happened to be the sister of Saladin. Reston in Warriors of God relates Saladins' response, quote, "When word of this outrage reached Saladin, his fury settled into a smoldering resolve. He sent a message to Chatillon. 'Where are the covenants? Return what you have taken.' Chatillon cast aside the message in contempt. The Sultan, in response, renewed his promise that when God put this villain into his hands, he would kill him with those same hands. To the newly crowned King of Jerusalem, meaning Guy of Lusignan, the Sultan protested the outrage. The king was reminded of the truce that had been solemnly struck with his predecessor. He demanded a return of the caravan and all of its wealth, and the release of its prisoners. The Sultan found a receptive audience. Chatillon's actions profoundly shocked the new king, and he insisted that the Prince of Kerak make restitution. But Chatillon refused to surrender his spoils. He responded by saying, "Just as he is the lord of his land, I am the lord of my land. I have no truce with the Arabs." And thus, with that one action, the fragile Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was divided, and the powerful Sultan was provoked. Chatillon's treachery had elevated Saladin's prestige throughout his empire and had made his cause righteous. A chain reaction had begun. End quote. From across his vast empire, now known as the Ayyubid, Saladin assembled his army. In May of 1187, he attacked and destroyed a Crusader force at the Battle of Reston. The Latin knights fell for a classic feigned retreat, and nearly the entire force was wiped out. This would be a decisive Ayyubid victory, but it would pale in comparison to what would happen next. In the heat of the summer of 1187, Saladin attacked again, bringing in an estimated 30,000 men. His plan was to lure the Crusaders into a fight on ground of his choosing. The Latin knights, on the other hand, had scored a settle after their defeat at Reston. Saladin deployed his scouts and determined the location of his enemy. Once he found them, he set up a means to lure them in. He laid siege to the city of Tiberias, which he would later take. When the king of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, heard about the fall of Tiberias, he marched his best troops right in. And it should be mentioned that these troops marked the bulk of what the Crusader states actually had. However, Guy of Lusignan, going against some of his own counsel's advice, rashly moved his men through arid lands that simply didn't have enough water. In his haste to attack the Muslims, he didn't even give his men enough time to replenish with the little water that they found. Dehydration would set in quickly, slowing his advance. The Sultan, meanwhile, kept his men back and well supplied. Saladin would later send in his horse archers to harass the Crusader column, and at night, raids were deployed to deprive Guy and his men of sleep. To make the situation even worse, the Sultan would set dry grass ablaze to produce smoke in order to choke the Latin host. On July 4th, 1187, Saladin sensed it was the right time to attack. On the slopes of an extinct volcano with twin peaks, known as the Horns of Hattin, Saladin managed to achieve complete encirclement of the exhausted and dehydrated Crusaders. That day, he won his masterpiece victory, known as the Battle of Hattin. He demolished the flower of the Crusader states and captured its king. When the battle was over, he brought Guy of Lusignan and Renald de Chatillon before him. To the king of Jerusalem, he offered amnesty, giving him a cup of iced rosewater. But for Renald de Chatillon, this would be his last day. It was later recorded that Saladin offered Renald the chance to convert, and when this was refused, the Sultan, true to his word, drew his sword and beheaded Renald on the spot. The army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was now eliminated. The Crusader states were now essentially helpless. Though they still possessed a bunch of cities, fortresses, and castles, there simply was not enough manpower left to defend them. Saladin's next move was clear. He captured a bunch of Crusader territory in order to complete an encirclement of what was to be his greatest prize. It was now time for the city of Jerusalem itself to come under a powerful siege by the Sultan and his Ayyubid army. The siege began on September 20th, 1187, just a few months after the Battle of Hattin. In what would be a last-ditch effort, the meager defenses of the city were strengthened by Balian of Ibelin. Balian had been in charge of the rear guard at the Battle of Hattin, but had managed to escape the carnage. However, once in charge of the city, he put up an intense defense that dragged on for 2 weeks. His resolve exhausted the Sultan's army and brought both sides to the negotiating table. James Reston explains how this all went down. Quote, Balian was advised to sue for peace. He sent an emissary to Saladin stating his readiness to talk. At first, Saladin was uninterested. My wise men say that Jerusalem can only be cleansed with Christian blood, he said bitterly. Then he reminded the ambassadors of what had happened 88 years before. My counsel tells me to take revenge for the Muslims whom Godfrey slew in the streets and even in the temple. Thus, a second embassy was sent and turned away, and finally a third came, led by Balian himself, to plead with Saladin to name his own conditions for the surrender. In return for the city, Balian asked amnesty for the people of Jerusalem, to which Saladin growled, "Neither amnesty nor mercy for you. Tomorrow will make us your masters. We shall kill and capture you and reduce the poor and the women to slavery." At this terrifying threat, Balian kept his wits and delivered his counter-threat. "If we must despair of your mercy, if we are sure there is no escape, we shall seek death like men. We shall hurl ourselves at you, we shall cast ourselves into the fire. Above all, we shall not dishonor ourselves. No one will be wounded until he has wounded 10 men himself. We will kill every Muslim prisoner in our hands, and we have thousands. We shall tear up the rock and leave you to enjoy the grief of losing it. We will burn the houses and pull down the dome and leave you the shame of reducing us to slavery." Balian then paused for effect. "What advantage do you gain from this ungenerous spirit? You, Sultan, stand to lose everything." End quote. Balian was right, and the Sultan knew it. In the end, Saladin offered terms that were generous. These were agreed to, and thus on October 2nd, 1187, the city of Jerusalem, once the capital of the Crusader states, was formally surrendered. With the capture of Jerusalem, Saladin's jihad was complete. His army, however, would not stop there. The rest of the Levant was slowly taken as one Crusader city and stronghold was taken. It was only the city of Tyre which managed to hold out. It became the rally point for what was left of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Saladin would lay siege to the city, but was unable to take it. Eventually, he had more pressing matters in the east to deal with. But leaving Tyre behind would come back to haunt the Sultan. Regardless, Saladin had assured his place in history. James Reston again eloquently brings all of this into perspective. Quote, "Saladin remains a preeminent hero of the Islamic world. It was he who united the Arabs, who defeated the Crusaders, who recaptured Jerusalem, and who threw the European invaders out of Arab lands. On the bars of a small dimly lit cell in the old city of Jerusalem, where Saladin lived humbly after his grand conquests, is the inscription, Allah Muhammad Salahadin, God, Prophet, Liberator. Such is Saladin's relation to the Muslim God." End quote. If the fall of Edessa had taken Europe as a shock, the fall of Jerusalem would rock it to its very core. When the Byzantine Empire heard of the defeat of their co-religionists, there was unfortunately very little that they could do. As mentioned before, with the death of Manuel I Komnenos in 1180, the Komnenian Restoration would effectively come to an end. In 1183, the government would be taken by Andronicus I Komnenos in a coup. The man had absolutely no love for Western Europe and its culture, a far cry from his predecessor. His reign began with a massacre of the Latins that were living in Constantinople. Again, many of those that were slaughtered were Venetians, something, by the way, that Venice would not easily forget. Andronicus employed harsh measures, and to his credit, he was able to severely curb corruption. But his hardline approach spilled over into tyranny. The man gained the reputation of using extreme and bizarre cruelty to keep his people in line. As the years progressed, it was whispered that his mind was eroding, he was becoming mad, and the latter part of his rule became a reign of terror. Finally, in 1185, his people had had enough and rose up in rebellion. The emperor was captured as he attempted to flee the city. In the end, he reaped what he sowed. He was publicly tortured for 3 days, before being hung upside down in the hippodrome, and 2 Latin soldiers bayoneted him with their swords till he died. From that moment onwards, the Eastern Empire began to fragment and descend into a new dark age. Byzantium would now have to sit on the sidelines, but in Western Europe, the response to the fall of Jerusalem would be met very differently. On October 29, 1187, Pope Gregory VIII would issue a papal bull calling for a new crusade to fight the Ayyubid Sultan. The response was once again very impressive. Frederick Barbarossa, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, mobilized a vast army and began to march. Philip II, the King of France, also heeded the call, but there was another that took up the cross as well. The King of England had also committed to the cause. He was known as Richard I. He would prove to be a master of warfare, a true contender for the great Sultan of the East. His battlefield exploits would gain him the name the Lionheart. The stage was now set for two of the greatest generals in history to go head-to-head. The Third Crusade had begun.